Welcome, dear listeners. Tonight, let the soothing sounds of the night embrace you as we journey into the enchanting tale of Elen, a young girl seeking a magical fountain guarded by a fierce dragon. Find your cozy spot, take a deep breath, and let my voice guide you into a world of wonder. Now, let us begin. In the shadow of the towering mountains, where the wind never seems to rest, lay a village older than memory itself. Its people were simple folk, tending to their flocks and crops, unaware of the mysteries that lay beyond their modest borders. Yet, among them, the ancient whispers of an old tale wove themselves into the quiet of the night, like threads of shadow lingering just at the edge of dreams. It was a tale that spoke of a fountain, hidden deep within the lair of a dragon, guarded by spells older than time. They said its waters shimmered with the light of 1,000 stars, and one sip from the fountain granted wisdom beyond the grasp of mortal minds. But such wisdom came at a cost, for no one had ever returned from the dragon's domain. The villagers dared not speak of it aloud, but in hushed tones, around flickering fires, they wondered. Could it be true? Elen had heard these whispers all her life. Orphaned young, she had no one to guide her but the winds themselves and the ancient stories that drifted through her heart like forgotten melodies. Her dreams were filled with visions of the fountain, visions that grew stronger with each passing year. It called to her like a faint song carried on the mountain air, luring her with promises of knowledge, of truth, of secrets yet to be uncovered. On the night of her 17th summer, when the moon hung low and heavy in the sky, Elen felt a strange pull. The village was quiet, save for the rustle of leaves and the distant cry of a lone bird. Yet, as she lay on her small bed, staring up at the wooden beams of her cottage, a voice, soft and haunting, whispered through her thoughts. "Seek the fountain, child of the winds. Your path has begun." She sat up, her heart pounding. The voice was like nothing she had ever heard, neither human nor animal, but something in between, something ancient. She rushed to the window, expecting to see a figure in the distance, a sign, but there was nothing. Only the mountains, dark and brooding, their peaks hidden beneath a veil of mist. Elen could not shake the feeling that something had awakened that night. The legend of the fountain, once just a story, now felt like a pulse beneath her skin. She had to know more. But who in the village would speak of such things? Who would dare entertain the thought of a journey into the heart of a dragon's lair? There was only one answer: the village elder. The elder was a woman of many winters, her face creased like the bark of an ancient tree, her eyes sharp and knowing. She lived in a small hut at the far edge of the village, away from the others, as though her knowledge itself was a burden too heavy to be borne in the light of day. Elen threw on her cloak and slipped out into the night. The The path to the elder's hut was overgrown, as though the very earth sought to keep it hidden. But she knew it well. She had visited the elder only once before, years ago, and the memory still lingered, like a shadow that refused to fade. As she approached the hut, the door creaked open of its own accord, revealing the dim glow of a single candle within. The elder sat by the fire, her back to the door, but Ellen felt the weight of her gaze even before she spoke. "You've heard the call," the elder said, her voice low and gravelly, as though it too had aged with time. "The fountain calls to you, child." Ellen stepped inside, the warmth of the fire a stark contrast to the chill in her bones. "How did you know?" The elder chuckled, a sound like dry leaves rustling in the wind. "I know many things, Ellen. I've been waiting for you. It is your fate." Ellen's breath caught. "The fountain, it's real, isn't it?" The elder turned then, her eyes gleaming with a strange light. "Real? Oh yes, child, it is real, but it is not what you think. The wisdom it offers is not freely given, nor is it without cost. If you seek it, you must be prepared to face not just the dragon, but the truth that lies within yourself." A shiver ran down Ellen's spine, but she couldn't turn back now. The path before her, mysterious and dark, had already begun to unfold. And somewhere, in the depths of the mountains, the fountain waited, guarded by shadows and flame, its secrets whispering through the night. Ellen stood before the fire in the elder's small hut, her heart heavy with the weight of what she had learned. The village elder, as ancient as the stones beneath the mountains, had spoken the words she feared and longed for in equal measure. The fountain was real. Its waters shimmered with the light of wisdom. But to find it was to court danger and risk losing herself to its depths. The elder watched her with eyes that glimmered like embers in the fading light. "You have come far, Ellen, but this journey you seek, it will not be one of simple roads and clear skies. The dragon that guards the fountain is no mere beast. It is a force bound to the ancient spells woven into the very earth. Few have sought the fountain, and none have returned." A cold dread settled in Ellen's stomach, though the flames from the hearth flickered warm and bright. "I've heard the stories, but—" She hesitated, the words catching in her throat like tangled threads. "Why now? Why me?" The elder's gaze did not waver. "The fountain chooses, child. It has called to you, as it has to others before you. Those who hear its song cannot turn away, for it beckons with the promise of truths not yet known. But be warned. Wisdom is a double-edged sword, and not all who seek it are ready to carry its burden." The firelight danced across the elder's face, casting shadows that seemed to shift and stretch, as if the darkness itself were listening. Ellen's thoughts churned, filled with questions she dared not voice. Yet one rose to the surface, trembling on her lips. "Is there a way to survive it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The dragon, the spells, can they be overcome? For a moment, silence filled the room, thick and heavy as the mountain fog. Then, with a slow nod, the elder rose from her seat, her bones creaking like the branches of an old tree. She moved to the far corner of the room, where a worn chest sat, half buried beneath a layer of dust. With a deliberate motion, she opened it and withdrew an object wrapped in faded cloth. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing a yellowed piece of parchment, old as the mountains themselves. "This," the elder said, her voice soft and reverent, "is the map." Elen's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the map. It was unlike any she had ever seen, its lines twisted and curled, not like paths, but like rivers of ink flowing toward an unseen destination. The parchment pulsed with a faint glow, and the more Elen gazed upon it, the more she felt as though it were alive, breathing beneath her fingertips. "The way to the fountain is hidden in shadows and spells," the elder continued. "This map will guide you, but only if you trust in it. You must follow its path, even when the road seems dark, even when the way is uncertain. And there is one more thing." The elder reached into the chest once more, pulling out a small amulet, simple and unadorned, save for the symbol of a coiled dragon etched into its surface. "Take this. It is the mark of the dragon. You will need it to enter its lair." Elen took the amulet in her hand, feeling its weight press against her palm like a stone heavy with untold secrets. The dragon's symbol seemed to pulse with a faint warmth, as though it were tied to something ancient and alive, far beyond the realm of human understanding. "The dragon will test you, Elen," the elder said, her voice low and filled with a somber weight. "It is not a creature of mere flesh and bone. It guards the fountain with its very essence, bound to it by the magic of the ancients. To face it is to face yourself, to unravel the truth of your heart. Be sure you are ready before you step beyond the threshold." Elen's pulse quickened, a heady mixture of fear and determination coursing through her veins. She had long dreamt of this journey, of discovering the truths that lay beyond the horizon of her small life. But now, standing at the precipice of something far greater than she had ever imagined, doubt began to creep in. "You will not be the same when you return," the elder whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "If you return at all." Elen clutched the amulet tightly, feeling the pulse of the dragon's mark thrumming against her skin. The choice was clear. Though the path ahead was shrouded in shadow and danger, she had already set her foot upon it. She turned toward the door, the elder's final words echoing in her ears like a distant warning. "Trust the map, Elen, and trust yourself. For in the end, only truth will guide you through the darkness." With the map in hand and the amulet around her neck, Elen stepped out into the night, where the wind howled like a beast in the mountains, and the stars flickered like forgotten memories. The journey had begun, and the fountain awaited her in the depths of the dragon's lair, guarded by spells that whispered of ages long past. The path into the forest of whispers was one seldom taken, a narrow trail winding between ancient oaks and thick, gnarled roots that clawed at the earth like the fingers of forgotten giants. Elen stood at the edge, her heart beating in rhythm with the wind that moaned softly through the trees. A mist clung low to the ground, weaving in and out of the undergrowth like ghostly tendrils, and with every step she took, it seemed to reach out for her, beckoning her deeper into the unknown. The village elder had warned her. This was no ordinary forest. It was a place alive with voices. Voices of those who had ventured here before, lured by the promise of the fountain, only to lose themselves in its winding trails and hidden snares. The trees, it was said, whispered to travelers, drawing out their deepest fears and desires, twisting reality until nothing remained but shadow and illusion. Elen felt the weight of these stories settle over her as she entered the forest, the air thick with an ancient magic that pressed against her skin like a damp fog. The map the elder had given her was tucked securely in her cloak, but it was of little use here. The lines and markings seemed to shift of their own accord, as though the forest itself was aware of her presence, reshaping its paths to test her resolve. As she ventured deeper, the trees began to change. Their bark was dark, almost black, and their branches curved overhead, forming a canopy so thick that only the faintest slivers of moonlight filtered through. The deeper she went, the more she felt the presence of something unseen, eyes watching her from the shadows, though no form revealed itself. Suddenly, a whisper, soft and almost imperceptible, brushed against her ear. At first she thought it was the wind, but as she listened more closely, she realized the voice was speaking her name. Elen! She froze, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. The voice was light, melodic, and achingly familiar. Though she could not place its source, it drifted through the trees, calling to her like a distant memory. Elen, you are lost. Her hand instinctively moved to the amulet around her neck, the dragon's mark cool against her skin. She had been warned of the voices, illusions designed to lead her astray. But still, they felt so real, so insistent. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to move forward. The path twisted and turned, winding deeper into the heart of the forest, where the mist grew thicker and the whispers louder. Now they were all around her, overlapping and blending together, their words like fragments of forgotten dreams. Turn back. The fountain is not for you. You will fail. Elen gritted her teeth and pressed on, refusing to be swayed by the voices. She knew the forest was testing her, probing her mind for weakness, seeking to sow doubt. But she had come too far to turn back now. The map, though it shifted in her hands, pulsed faintly with a guiding light, drawing her forward, even as the trees seemed to close in around her. It wasn't long before the forest revealed its first true illusion. Ahead, through the mist, Ellen saw a figure, tall, cloaked in shadow, standing in the middle of the path. Her breath caught in her throat as the figure stepped forward, the face slowly coming into view. It was her mother. Ellen's heart skipped a beat. Her mother, who had been taken by sickness so many years ago, now stood before her, eyes filled with sorrow and longing. "Ellen," the figure whispered, the voice soft and familiar. "Why do you seek what you cannot have? Come back, my child. There is nothing for you here but pain." Tears pricked at the corners of Ellen's eyes, the sight of her mother stirring memories she had buried long ago. For a brief moment, she felt the pull of the illusion, the temptation to believe, to follow the voice of someone she had loved so deeply. But something in her heart told her it was not real. Her mother was gone. This was the forest doing, a cruel trick to lead her astray. She closed her eyes and took a steadying breath. "You're not real," she whispered, her voice firm, though it trembled at the edges. "You're not real." When she opened her eyes again, the figure had vanished, replaced by the endless expanse of trees and mist. The path lay before her once more, winding deeper into the heart of the forest. The whispers quieted, but the weight of the illusion lingered in the air, like the echo of a dream not yet forgotten. Ellen clutched the amulet tightly and continued forward, her steps more resolute than before. She had passed the first test of the forest, but she knew it would not be the last. The fountain was still far beyond her reach, hidden within layers of spells and shadows, and the dragon's lair awaited her at the journey's end. As the trees closed in around her, and the mist thickened once more, Ellen felt the forest watching, waiting for its next move. And somewhere, deep in the heart of the woods, the fountain whispered its secrets, just out of reach. Ellen emerged from the forest of whispers, shaken but unbroken, the strange pull of the dragon's lair drawing her onward. The sky above her was a pale, cold grey, and the mountains loomed closer now, their jagged peaks cutting into the clouds like the teeth of some ancient beast. She felt their weight pressing down on her, as though the stones themselves bore the burden of centuries of forgotten secrets. The air here was different, thicker, charged with something she couldn't quite name. As she walked, the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, and with each step, she felt as though the earth itself was alive, watching, waiting. Her fingers traced the edge of the amulet around her neck, its cool surface grounding her against the unease creeping through her mind. The symbol of the coiled dragon shimmered faintly in the dim light, a reminder of what lay ahead. Somewhere within these mountains was the dragon's lair, the final gate before the fountain. The path before her narrowed into a winding ravine, its steep walls lined with jagged stones that seemed to whisper as the wind swept through. She followed it carefully, her senses alert to every sound, every movement in the shadows. It wasn't long before she came to a sudden stop. Ahead, etched into the face of a massive stone, was the mark of the dragon. The stone was ancient, older than the village, older than the forest. Its surface weathered and cracked, but the symbol was unmistakable. It glowed faintly, as if lit from within by a fire long extinguished, but never truly gone. The mark was a perfect match to the one on her amulet. A coiled dragon, its tail wrapped around itself, its eyes wide and unblinking. Elen approached cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. The air seemed to thrum with an invisible energy, growing stronger with each step she took towards the stone. As she reached out to touch the mark, a sudden wave of heat pulsed through her, as if the stone itself were alive, waiting for her arrival. Her fingers brushed the surface of the stone, and in that moment, the world around her shifted. The wind stilled. The ground trembled beneath her feet, and the faint whispers that had followed her through the ravine grew louder, more insistent. But these voices were not like those in the forest of whispers. These were older, deeper, resonating with the weight of centuries long past. Seeker of wisdom. The voice was not one, but many. A chorus of ancient tones that echoed through her mind, pulling her into their depths. Elen tried to step back, but her hand was fixed to the stone, as though an unseen force held her there. You seek what you do not understand. The fountain's wisdom is not freely given. Her vision blurred, and before her eyes, the stone began to shift. The coiled dragon etched into the surface began to move, unwrapping itself from the stone, its scales shimmering as if made of molten gold. Its eyes glowed with a fierce, otherworldly light, and its serpentine body twisted and stretched, emerging from the stone as if it had been waiting for this moment for centuries. Elen's breath caught in her throat as the dragon, no longer a mere symbol, rose before her, its great wings unfurling with a sound like distant thunder. Its gaze met hers, and she felt the weight of its power, ancient and unknowable. The dragon did not speak, but its presence was a language all its own. In its eyes, Elen saw the passage of time itself, the rise and fall of kingdoms, the endless cycle of birth and death. The dragon was not merely a guardian, it was the embodiment of the knowledge she sought, bound to the fountain by magic as old as the mountains themselves. As she stood frozen before it, the dragon lowered its head, its great golden eyes fixed on the amulet hanging from her neck. The symbol of the coiled dragon pulsed faintly, as if in response to the presence of the creature before her. Without a word, the dragon raised one clawed foot and pressed it gently against her chest. A sudden surge of energy flooded through her, filling her with a strange and terrible understanding. The The fountain's wisdom was within her reach, but it would not come without a cost. The dragon's mark, now glowing bright upon her chest, burned with the heat of ancient magic. Elen gasped, the sensation overwhelming her senses. She felt as though she were being unmade and remade all at once, her very soul touched by the ancient spell that bound the dragon to its purpose. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, it ended. The dragon withdrew its claw and turned, its great wings stirring the wind as it curled once more into the stone. The glow of the mark faded, and the ravine fell silent once more, as if nothing had happened. Elen stood, her chest still pulsing with the mark's heat, her heart racing. She had passed the first of the dragon's tests, but the lair awaited, and beyond it, the fountain. The mark now bound her to the journey ahead, a reminder that there was no turning back. The path forward would be treacherous, but she was ready. With a final glance at the stone, Elen stepped forward, deeper into the mountain's embrace, the whispers of the ancient dragon still echoing in her mind. The deeper Elen ventured into the mountains, the more the world seemed to unravel around her. The path grew narrow and treacherous, winding between jagged cliffs that loomed overhead like silent sentinels. The wind had a different quality here, colder, sharper, carrying with it the weight of something ancient and watchful. The mark of the dragon on her chest pulsed faintly beneath her cloak, a reminder of the test that had bound her to this journey. Ahead, the narrow ravine gave way to a vast chasm, too wide to cross, its depths shrouded in a thick, swirling fog that seemed to breathe with a life of its own. The ground dropped off sharply, the rocky edges crumbling into the abyss. And as Elen approached, she felt the air shift, heavier, denser, as though something unseen was stirring beneath the fog. For a moment she hesitated. The way forward was unclear. There was no visible bridge, no sign of how to cross. She reached into her cloak and pulled out the map the elder had given her, but its lines and markings had shifted once again. The once familiar paths now seemed to coil and twist like living things, their meaning obscured by some unseen magic. The bridge had to be here, somewhere. Elen's breath caught as a figure materialized from the fog. It was barely discernible at first, just a silhouette. A man cloaked in shadow, standing on the far side of the chasm. He did not move, but his presence filled the air with a strange tension, as though the very ground beneath her feet was waiting for something to happen. The figure raised an arm, and as he did, a dark spectral bridge began to emerge from the fog. It stretched across the chasm, formed not of stone or wood, but of shadow, dark, twisting tendrils that wove together, creating a path as insubstantial as smoke. It shimmered faintly, barely visible, a flickering mirage on the edge of reality. Elen's pulse quickened. This was the Bridge of Shadows. The elder had spoken of it in hushed tones, warning of its nature. The bridge was not just a crossing, it was a trial, a test of the soul. Only those who could face the darkness within themselves would reach the other side. She took a step toward the bridge, and the air around her seemed to thicken, the fog curling at her ankles like living mist. The figure remained unmoving on the far side, his features still obscured by shadow. But his presence filled her with an eerie sense of foreboding. The first step onto the bridge was tentative. The surface beneath her feet felt both solid and weightless, as though it might dissolve at any moment, casting her into the depths below. But she pressed on, her eyes fixed on the distant figure. The fog closed in around her, and with each step, the world seemed to shift, the shadows whispering at the edges of her mind. You cannot escape the truth. The whisper was soft, barely audible, but it cut through her thoughts like a blade. Ellen stopped, her heart pounding. The voice had come from the shadows themselves, the mist swirling around her like a veil, and as she stood there, a shape began to emerge from the fog. A figure stepped out onto the bridge, moving toward her. It was tall, cloaked in darkness, but as it drew closer, Ellen's blood ran cold. She knew this figure. It was herself, her reflection, her mirror image, but twisted, darker. Its eyes gleamed with something malevolent, a deep and terrible knowledge that mirrored her own fears. The shadow self spoke, its voice a low, mocking echo of her own. You think you can cross this bridge? You think you are worthy of the fountain's wisdom? You are nothing but a child, lost in a world you do not understand. Ellen's chest tightened, her hand instinctively moving to the amulet around her neck. The dragon's mark was warm beneath her fingers, but the weight of the shadow's words pressed heavily on her heart. You are afraid, the shadow continued, stepping closer. Afraid of the truth, afraid of what you might find at the end of this path. You do not seek wisdom, you seek escape. The words echoed in her mind, the truth of them cutting deep. She had known fear on this journey, doubt and uncertainty. The voices in the forest of whispers had nearly led her astray. And now, here on the bridge of shadows, her darkest fears were given form. The shadow before her was not an enemy. It was a reflection of the battle she waged within herself. Ellen took a deep breath, her gaze steady as she met the eyes of her shadow self. I am afraid, she said, her voice firm, though it trembled at the edges. But that does not mean I will turn back. The shadow paused, its form flickering as though caught between the mist and the darkness. The mocking gleam in its eyes dimmed, and for a moment the two stood in silence, facing one another. One, a child of flesh and bone, the other, a creature of shadow and fear. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, the shadow stepped aside, dissolving into the fog as if it had never been. Ellen's heart pounded in her chest, but she moved forward, her steps more certain than before. The bridge stretched out before her, and with each step, the mist began to clear, the chasm narrowing as the distant figure on the other side became clearer. She had crossed the bridge of shadows, but the trials were not yet over, and the dragon's lair still awaited her, its ancient spells guarding the way to the fountain. The mist of the bridge of shadows slowly dissipated behind Elen as she pressed on, her mind heavy with the encounter. The whispers of her shadow self still echoed faintly, though they grew more distant with each step, fading into the deeper recesses of her memory. The path before her was no longer winding but steep, carved into the jagged rock of the mountainside. Above, the sky was a sickly, bruised grey, as though the heavens themselves had darkened with the weight of what lay ahead. It wasn't long before the sound reached her, a low, ominous murmur, like the distant hum of something vast and unseen. As she descended further, the sound grew louder, sharper, until it was unmistakable. Water. The path curved, opening into a wide, barren expanse of rock. And there, cutting through the mountains like a scar, was the cursed river. Its black waters churned restlessly, reflecting none of the light that clung to the mountains above. It moved with unnatural speed, crashing against the jagged rocks on its banks, as though eager to devour anything that dared come near. Elen stopped at the edge, her breath catching in her throat. The elder had spoken of this river in her warnings, of the souls it had claimed, the travellers who had lost their way, carried down into its endless depths. The river had no mercy, no patience. It flowed endlessly, an unyielding current of curses and forgotten dreams. She scanned the banks, searching for a way across, but there was none. No bridge, no stepping stones, only the angry rush of water and the jagged cliffs rising on either side. Her hand went to the map tucked into her cloak, but as she unfolded it, the lines had once again shifted. The river was marked, a dark, twisting vein cutting through the heart of the mountains. But the path forward remained hidden. The map offered no solutions, only questions. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and something darker, something that clung to the edges of her senses. The whispers began again, soft at first, but growing louder as she stood at the river's edge. "You are lost. Turn back!" The voices rose from the water itself, as though the river was alive with the spirits of those who had drowned within it. The words were sharp, taunting, twisting around her like a coil of serpents. But beneath the noise, she could hear something else. Another voice, quieter, steadier. It wasn't the river, but something deeper, a presence that moved beneath the surface, ancient and waiting. The elder's final words came back to her then, clearer now than they had been before. The river can only be crossed by one who knows their true purpose. Elen's pulse quickened. She understood now. This was not just a river. It was a gate, a test as much as the Bridge of Shadows had been. The cursed river demanded more than just strength. It required certainty, the kind that ran deeper than fear. She knelt at the water's edge, the black current lapping dangerously close to her feet. "I seek the fountain," she whispered, her voice swallowed by the roar of the river. "I seek wisdom." The water surged, crashing against the rocks, as though mocking her. The whispers rose again, louder, more insistent. "You do not know what you seek. You will drown like the others." But Elen closed her eyes, shutting out the voices. Her heart pounded with the weight of her purpose, the reason she had set out on this journey. She had lived her life in the shadows of doubt, seeking answers she could not name, driven by the promise of something greater. The fountain had called to her, not as a mere myth, but as a truth she had known all along. "I seek the truth," she said, her voice steady now. "Whatever the cost." At her words, the river stilled. The black water stopped its restless churning, the violent current slowing until it was smooth as glass. The air shifted, growing heavier, and the whispers fell silent. In the quiet, Elen opened her eyes and found the river transformed. A narrow path, carved from the water itself, appeared before her, its surface glistening in the dim light. Her breath caught in her throat, but there was no time for hesitation. She stepped onto the path, her feet skimming the surface of the water, and the river did not stir. The black depths stretched out on either side of her, silent and watchful, as though waiting for her to falter. But she did not. Her steps were sure, her purpose clear. She knew now what the river had demanded of her. Not just resolve, but clarity. The journey was not just one of seeking knowledge, but of understanding the price of it, the sacrifices that came with true wisdom. As Elen reached the far bank, the path dissolved behind her, the river resuming its wild, cursed flow. She stood on the edge of the next part of her journey, the dragon's lair now closer than ever, the ancient spells guarding it already whispering in the wind. The cursed river had tested her, but she had crossed its waters with purpose. The fountain's wisdom awaited, but so too did the final trial. The dragon itself, bound to the secrets of the fountain, watching from its darkened lair. Elen stood at the mouth of the cavern, her breath catching as she gazed into the yawning abyss that stretched before her. The dragon's lair. The air was thick with a palpable magic, ancient and potent, clinging to the rocks like an invisible mist. The sky above was hidden behind clouds so dark they seemed to drain the light from the world, leaving only a faint, cold glow to guide her steps. The entrance was no more than a crack in the mountainside, but it seemed to pulse with a silent power, as if the mountain itself breathed slowly, waiting. Beyond that crack lay the heart of the journey, the final gate between her and the fountain. The air trembled with the faintest echoes of something stirring deep within. Ellen felt it in her bones, a low, thrumming vibration that made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. She reached for the amulet at her throat, the dragon's mark warm against her skin, as if responding to the proximity of the lair. It was alive, just as the dragon was alive, both bound to something far older than the world Ellen had known. She stepped inside, the stone walls pressing close around her as she ventured deeper into the cave. The light from the outside world dimmed, fading into shadows, until the only sound was the echo of her footsteps against the cold rock. Every breath she took felt like an intrusion, as though she was walking into a place that was not meant for the living. The tunnel twisted and turned, its curves as serpentine as the dragon that guarded it. Strange symbols etched into the stone walls glowed faintly, their meaning lost to time, yet Ellen could feel their power. They were wards, enchantments laid long ago to protect the dragon's realm from those unworthy of the fountain's wisdom. The deeper she went, the more she sensed the presence waiting ahead. It was not just the dragon. It was something greater, something vast and unnameable, a force that had existed before stories were written, before kingdoms rose and fell. And then, without warning, the tunnel opened into a vast chamber. Ellen stopped at the threshold, her breath stolen by the sight before her. The cavern was enormous, its ceiling so high it disappeared into darkness, and the walls were lined with ancient carvings, telling stories of gods and beasts, of battles fought long before her time. At the center of it all, curled atop a bed of shimmering gold and ancient treasures, was the dragon. It was larger than she could have ever imagined, its scales a deep, iridescent black that shimmered in the dim light as if reflecting the very void of the sky. Its great wings were folded against its sides, and its eyes, those golden eyes, were half closed, watching her with a gaze that pierced through flesh and bone. Ellen's pulse quickened, her heart thudding in her chest as the full weight of the creature's presence pressed down on her. The air around the dragon shimmered with heat, though no fire burned. It was the heat of something ancient, something eternal. And as the dragon stirred, the ground beneath her feet trembled. The dragon's eyes opened fully, locking onto hers. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The dragon did not roar, did not move. It simply watched her, and in that gaze, Ellen felt the presence of the fountain itself, the wisdom she sought, the knowledge that had drawn her here. But it was clear that the dragon was more than a guardian. It was the fountain's other half, bound to it in ways Ellen could not yet understand. "I have come for the fountain," Ellen whispered, her voice small against the vastness of the lair. The dragon's gaze did not waver. Its golden eyes flickered with something she could not name. Curiosity, perhaps, or understanding. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, the dragon rose to its full height, its wings unfurling slightly, casting deep shadows across the cavern floor. A voice filled the chamber, though the dragon's mouth did not move. It was deep, ancient and vast, like the shifting of the earth itself. The fountain is not for the weak of heart, nor the faint of spirit. The dragon's voice was not cruel, but neither was it kind. It was simply truth, unyielding and unmerciful. You seek wisdom, yet you do not know the cost. The fountain offers no answers freely. Ellen's heart pounded in her chest, but she stood her ground. "I know the cost," she said, her voice stronger now. "I am ready to pay it." The dragon's golden eyes flickered again, as though weighing her words. It stepped forward, the ground trembling beneath its weight, and the heat of its presence washed over her like a wave. It lowered its great head, so close now that she could see the intricate patterns in its scales, and its eyes burned with a terrible intensity. "You will be tested," the dragon said, its voice a rumble that shook the very air. "Not by me, but by the truth you seek." Ellen swallowed, her hand tightening around the amulet at her neck. The dragon's words were a warning, but they did not frighten her. She had come too far, crossed too many thresholds, to turn back now. Whatever the test was, she would face it. The dragon stepped aside, revealing the path that led deeper into the lair, toward the fountain itself. Its eyes followed her as she stepped forward, the air thick with the weight of the moment. The dragon did not speak again, but its presence lingered, a silent reminder that the final test was yet to come. As Ellen moved deeper into the shadows, the sound of the dragon's breath faded, replaced by the soft, distant hum of something vast and unknowable. The fountain awaited. The tunnel narrowed as Ellen moved deeper into the dragon's lair, the air thick with the scent of earth and something older, something unnameable. The faint hum she had heard before grew louder, more insistent, vibrating through the stone beneath her feet. The weight of the cavern pressed down on her, not physically, but in the way one feels the presence of something vast and powerful, something beyond human understanding. Ahead, the tunnel widened once more, and a pale, ghostly light flickered from beyond the shadows. Ellen's heart quickened as she stepped into the chamber, her breath catching in her throat. There it was, the fountain of wisdom. It stood at the center of the chamber, bathed in an ethereal glow that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The fountain was unlike anything she had ever seen, its base carved from ancient stone, but the water that filled it shimmered with a light that was neither liquid nor flame. It flowed with an unnatural stillness, as though time itself had stopped to gaze into its depths. The water sparkled, a soft radiance that beckoned with a promise of answers, of truths long buried beneath the weight of the world. Ellen could feel its pull, a magnetic force that drew her closer with every step. It was as if the air around the fountain was charged with the knowledge of ages, waiting to be unlocked. But even as she approached, Ellen felt a strange resistance, like a wall of unseen energy pressing back against her. The closer she came, the heavier the air became, as if the fountain itself was testing her resolve, asking her silently, "Are you truly ready?" She hesitated, her hand reaching for the amulet at her throat, feeling its familiar weight. The dragon's mark was warm, almost hot now, a reminder of the journey she had undertaken and the warning she had been given. The fountain was no mere spring of knowledge. It was a force, an entity of its own, and its gift of wisdom would not come without a price. She stepped closer still, her reflection shimmering in the water. But the reflection was not quite her own. The face that stared back at her was older, the eyes hollow and distant, filled with knowledge too vast for any one soul to bear. The reflection flickered, changing with every breath she took, showing her glimpses of what she might become if she drank from the fountain, what she might lose. Her heart pounded in her chest as the weight of the moment settled over her. The stories had been true. The fountain granted wisdom, but it also demanded something in return. It was not a question of whether she could drink from it, but whether she could carry the burden of the knowledge it offered. The water sparkled again, and the hum in the air grew louder, more insistent, as if the fountain itself was urging her forward. Ellen closed her eyes for a moment, steadying her breath. She had come here seeking answers, but now, standing at the edge of the fountain, she realized the question had changed. This was not just about knowledge. It was about truth, the raw, unfiltered truth of the world and of herself. And that truth would come at a cost. Slowly, she knelt beside the fountain, her hand hovering over the shimmering water. The air around her seemed to pulse, the energy of the fountain vibrating through her very bones. For a brief moment, she hesitated, her mind flickering with doubts. What if the truth was more than she could bear? What if the cost was too great? But then she remembered the journey, the forest of whispers, the bridge of shadows, the cursed river. She had passed every test, faced every trial, and now the fountain awaited her, offering her the final piece of the puzzle. With a deep breath, Ellen dipped her hand into the water. The moment her fingers touched the surface, a surge of energy rushed through her, flooding her senses with light and sound, and something far beyond either. The water was cool, but it burned with the heat of 1,000 suns, filling her with a knowledge so vast and so ancient that it nearly overwhelmed her. She gasped, her body trembling as the weight of the fountain's wisdom pressed down on her. Visions flashed before her eyes, cities rising and falling, kingdoms built and destroyed, the faces of those who had come before her, their eyes hollow with the weight of the truths they had seen. And beneath it all, She saw herself, her past, her future, her deepest fears, and her greatest hopes. The fountain revealed all, holding nothing back, stripping away the illusions of the world and laying bare the reality beneath. She saw the truth of the dragon, the ancient spells that bound it to the fountain, and the curse that had turned it into a guardian of wisdom. She saw the cost of knowledge, the loss of innocence, the burden of carrying truths too heavy for the heart to hold. And yet, within that burden, there was a strange beauty, a clarity that came only with understanding. The visions faded, leaving Elen kneeling beside the fountain, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The weight of the knowledge still pressed against her, but it no longer crushed her. She understood now. The fountain did not offer answers. It offered understanding. And with understanding came a choice. Slowly she rose to her feet, her mind still buzzing with the weight of the truths she had seen. The fountain's glow flickered softly, its waters calm and still once more, as if waiting for her next move. The final test was not yet over. The chamber was silent, save for the soft hum of the fountain behind Elen, its water shimmering like stardust, a quiet witness to all that had transpired. The visions from the fountain still danced at the edges of her mind, their truths like whispers that could not be unheard. The weight of the knowledge she had absorbed clung to her, heavy yet strangely clear, as though she had stepped beyond the veil of the world and seen the fragile threads that held it together. But now, standing on the edge of that revelation, she knew her journey was not over. There was one last trial, one last choice. The air around her seemed to shift, as if the very stones of the chamber held their breath. Elen felt the dragon's presence before she saw it, the ancient power that had been with her from the moment she stepped into the lair. Slowly she turned, her pulse quickening as the dragon emerged from the shadows. It moved with a grace that defied its size, its great black wings folding gently against its sides, the glow of its golden eyes piercing the dim light. The dragon stood before her, its gaze intense, but not unkind. Elen could feel the ancient magic that bound the creature to this place, tied to the fountain, to the wisdom it guarded. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, the dragon's voice filled the chamber, deep and resonant, like the echo of mountains long forgotten. "You have touched the fountain," the dragon said, its voice carrying the weight of centuries. "You have seen what it offers, and now you must decide. The wisdom of the fountain is not a gift to be taken lightly, nor can it be kept without cost. What you know now will change the path before you." Elen's breath caught. She knew this was coming, the final choice, the one that would define not just her journey but her life. The fountain's knowledge had filled her with truths too vast to ignore. Yet with those truths came the burden of understanding. of seeing the world not as it was, but as it truly is. "What is the cost?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. The dragon's eyes gleamed with a knowing light. "The truth you now hold will weigh upon you. It will shape the choices you make, the paths you walk. Wisdom is a burden, for it reveals the darkness in light and the light in darkness. To carry it is to never again see the world in simple terms. It will change you, Elen, forever." A chill passed through her, not of fear, but of realization. She had felt that change already, from the moment she touched the fountain's water. The knowledge had seeped into her bones, unraveling the comfortable illusion she had once held dear. The cost was not one of coin or treasure. It was the loss of certainty, the loss of ignorance. But even in that loss, there was power. Power to see beyond the surface, to understand the world in ways that few ever could. And with that power came the responsibility to act, to choose what to do with the knowledge she now possessed. The dragon's voice rumbled through the chamber once more. "You can leave this place unchanged. The knowledge will fade. The memories of what you have seen will slip away, and you may return to the world as it was before. Or..." The dragon's gaze bore into her, and Elen felt the weight of the choice pressed down on her shoulders. "Or you may keep the wisdom of the fountain. You will leave this place forever altered, carrying the truth of the world within you. But know this: those who walk with such knowledge walk alone. The path of the wise is a lonely one, for few will understand the burdens you carry." Elen stood in silence, the dragon's words echoing in her mind. The choice seemed impossible, yet it was the only one that mattered now. To walk away from the wisdom she had sought all her life, to let it slip through her fingers like a fading dream, would be to return to a life of comfort, but also one of ignorance. To keep it would be to embrace the burden, the uncertainty, and the isolation that came with it. She thought of the journey she had undertaken, the forest of whispers, the bridge of shadows, the cursed river. Each test had revealed something about herself, something deeper and truer than she had ever known. And now, standing at the edge of the fountain's light, she understood the truth of the journey. The wisdom was not in the answers the fountain gave. It was in the choice it demanded of her. Elen met the dragon's gaze, her heart steady. "I choose to keep the wisdom." The dragon did not react at first, but something in its golden eyes shifted, a flicker of understanding passing between them. Slowly, it inclined its great head, a gesture of acknowledgement, of acceptance. "Then go, Elen," the dragon said, its voice softer now, almost gentle. "The world awaits you. The path is yours to walk." With that, the dragon stepped aside, revealing the exit to the chamber. The light from the fountain dimmed behind her as she turned, its glow fading into the shadows. Elen walked toward the light. The weight of the fountain's wisdom settled within her. She had chosen truth, chosen the path of the wise, and though it would be a difficult road, she did not regret it. The world beyond the lair awaited, vast and unknowable, and she would face it with eyes wide open. As she stepped into the open air, the wind whispered softly through the mountains, carrying with it the faintest echo of the dragon's voice, a reminder of the choice she had made. And so Elen, the seeker of wisdom, began her journey anew.